2025 is on track to go down in history as one of, if not the best, years for JRPG re-releases of all time. On top of a pretty stacked lineup of brand new releases, we've also already gotten remasters or remakes for the first two Suikoden games, Tales of Graces, and Xenoblade Chronicles X. And later on in the year, we're going to get things like Dragon Quest 1 and 2, Tales of Xillia, Final Fantasy Tactics, and most importantly for this video, The Legend of Heroes: Trails in the Sky. The demo for Trails in the Sky First Chapter is out now on PC and PlayStation, with a Switch version coming later, and I was lucky enough to get early access to it courtesy of GungHo Entertainment. Though, as you might notice, I did not have this video ready for the public release of the demo because I did literally everything possible on the hardest difficulty and put almost 9.5 hours into it. This demo is big. It covers the entire prologue, which when going off the original game is a bit under a fifth of the total length, and it is enough to say that this is an extremely good remake of an already great game, and with any luck we'll finally put to rest all the arguments at where the best place to start the series is. I am now going to proceed to vomit my thoughts about it in no particular order with no sense of reason. But I will not be spoiling things because I want people who are interested in Trails to pick up this game when it comes out next month. I won't be directly discussing the story at all, but there will be cutscenes playing in the background throughout a lot of this, and if you're really curious, you could just look up the beginning of a Let's Play of this demo or the original game, or if you want to go in completely blind, just start playing the demo for yourself. I think the biggest way I can sum up my thoughts on this are the two things that just kept going through my mind the further I progressed in the demo. And they were, oh my god, I didn't know it was possible to remake something this faithfully. Literally everything except the combat is exactly the same as the original game. And then also, oh my god, who gave Falcom a budget? This is without a doubt the best looking game I've ever seen from the studio. And in spite of the visuals and the improved map size, it's pretty technically impressive too. The entire outside overworld of the region you can access during the prologue, plus a dungeon, plus the top floor of another dungeon, is all on the same map with no loading screens. Something that, by my count, took 20 screens in the original game to cover, and the only reason the inside of buildings are behind loading screens when they weren't in other recent Trails games is because everything is so faithful to the original maps that the insides are bigger than the outsides. One of my biggest concerns when the remake was announced was that they would sterilize the charm out of the original Trails in the Sky, flattening everything out and making it look slicker and more modernized like the Trails Through Daybreak games, which is an art style that completely fits those games, but just does not work with the grounded rustic charm and steampunk aesthetic of the Sky arc. But thankfully, despite a different character designer, it really does just feel the same. Even when assets are reused from other games, the changes in shaders and lighting applied to this remake makes them fit in completely well with models that were made from the ground up for Sky First Chapter. Returning to Laboral in the remake does feel like coming back home. I'm also genuinely impressed by how they somehow managed to take areas that, while 3D, were designed for a top-down isometric game where player characters would be represented by chibified sprites, and recreated them as one-to-one as possible for a full 3D game with complete camera control and more realistic proportions. All of the small details are still there, except they might have added a small animal or two just hanging around enjoying the vibes. The straw hat and 2 wine bottles in Estelle's bedroom? Yep, those are there. The completely nonsensical hotel bathrooms that consist of nothing but a bathtub with a shower head and no curtain and 1 wall mirror without a sink? Well, that's what Falcom did in 2004, so that is what Falcom did in 2025. While the character portraits from the original game are absolutely iconic, I do think the 3D models are expressive enough where the cutscenes don't lose anything for not having them in this version, which is very good, as that was another one of my major concerns going into this. They nailed Estelle's smugness, and that's probably the most important thing to do when you're making a new version of Trails in the Sky. I've seen people dooming about a statement by the game's director that it took another developer about 80 hours to 100% complete the game, and that people were thinking that this would mean there would be more bloat and filler added. Now, we know they're adding new content that wasn't in the original game, and there wasn't any of that in this prologue, but even with that, my playtime was not that much longer than it would have taken to do everything I did in the original, with most of the difference in length being accounted for by the fact that on my last playthrough of the original FC, I did not play on the hardest difficulty, which caused battles to take longer in the remake, and then also I did not talk to every NPC at every possible opportunity, although that might have been mitigated in terms of time added in the remake because there is also the fast travel system, and not only is most of the overworld on one map, but loading times across the board are almost instant. Granted, I am playing this on a powerful computer, one that's probably more powerful than necessary to run any Falcom game, but everything was loading so fast that I literally could never read a single loading screen message. And the extra sad part is the loading screens show your party in the original sprites from the original game in the lower right hand corner, and I barely got to look at that because, boom, I was at my next location immediately. That's another thing I was surprised by. This is a really impressive PC port job, especially when accounting for the fact that Falcom hasn't done them in-house for over a decade until this game. Is it as good and does it have as many bells and whistles as the PH3 ports of other recent Falcom games? No, but it is most of the way there, and I had absolutely zero performance issues running at 4K 60 FPS maximum settings, which is saying something when a lot of other recent RPGs with a lot higher budgets than this one that were also ported to PC in-house barely run and have never received patches. A good PC port for a Trails game existing isn't a massive deal for Western fans, but for PC players in Asian regions outside of Japan, this is an absolute game changer as they will no longer be stuck with the Clouded Leopard ports, which were notoriously bad. One setting I was pleasantly surprised by is the option to switch between 3 different soundtracks. The first is the brand new version of the OST composed specifically for this game, and I will probably stick with that for my entire playthrough as it is, again, a pretty good, pretty faithful recreation of the original, using mostly the same instrumentation but with higher quality samples and often a lot more instruments added to each individual piece. It captures the vibe of the original pretty well, while also just sounding like it comes from a game releasing this year. That might not be what you'd like out of the soundtrack if you're playing this remake for nostalgia, but don't worry, you can just straight up switch to the original soundtrack if you would like. There is also a third option, one that is labeled Customize in the English version, and when I first saw that, I thought I was going to be given the option to pick between the original and arranged OSTs on a track-by-track basis. But no, Customize is actually a third version of the entire OST, the one that was created for the EVO versions of the Trails in the Sky trilogy, a set of Japan-only remasters that were launched to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Trails series. It is a pretty controversial version of the soundtrack, but it is there as an option for people who prefer it. Though it definitely shouldn't be called Customize in English. It should probably be Original, Arranged, and New, instead of Original, Customize, and Normal. But yeah, that is my one major complaint. There is a bit of jank in not only the way things are worded in menus, but in text and dialogue in the game as a whole, though that's a big discussion, so I'll save that for last. While we're talking about sound, I think the new dub is pretty good performance-wise, and my only real complaints with it come from a few smaller characters' performances and localization things. Out of the entire cast, Josette is the only major character who's voiced in other Trails games who's not being played by the same person who most recently played that character, so everyone is super comfortable with their roles by now. This does mean that a few characters are not played by the same person who played them in the original Trails in the Sky dubs, but at this point, they're maintaining continuity with the most recent games. I think it's okay to not have Patrick Seitz as Zin this time. He already plays like every other Falcom character, and if they remake the second Sky game, he's gonna be back as Mueller anyway. Pretty much every major character who's just getting their first English voice now is cast really well too, and I have to especially shout out Ina and Dorothy for sounding almost exactly like I would expect them to. The amount of scenes voice acted is unfortunately not as comprehensive as the aforementioned EVO versions were, and I did already run into a couple instances of the really janky thing Trails games do, where only one side of the conversation is voice acted because the protagonist just doesn't speak for whatever reason, but I do think the quality of the rest of the presentation is enough to make up for it. While most cutscenes are still text boxes playing while characters do stock emotes and make expressions at each other, I think the camera angles are a bit more dynamic than they have been, but again, the faces are pretty emotive and the stock animations are a bit higher quality than they have been in other Trails games, Though if Estelle punches her palm again, I'm going to start having FF14 war flashbacks. One thing where the animations really shine though is in combat. Turns out when you make a Trails game that only has 8 playable characters, and not 24, you can spend a lot more time giving each individual character proper attention, and not have to reuse quite as many animations from the previous game. On top of that, these all just look really cool. The art animations are good and not reused from other games. The craft animations are really impressive, and this is the first time the series has ever had multiple options for an animation for an individual attack. And well, just look at the S-craft animations. These are some of the coolest looking super attacks I've seen in a recent RPG period. And yeah, while we're here, let's talk about the gameplay of this game. While the overworld and story are faithfully recreated, the battle system itself is drawing from more recent Trails titles. I don't think the original Trails in the Skies combat has aged poorly or anything, and honestly, despite the massive amount of quality of life improvements, I think the original is still completely playable if you'd rather just play through the original trilogy now instead of waiting for all of them to get remade. But it is undoubtedly the simplest combat in the series, so I understand the decision to add a lot more elements to it. In doing so, they took the base combat of Trails Through Daybreak, the first game in the current story arc of the series and the one that premiered this battle style, ported the cast of Sky and their abilities, as well as the magic system to that, and then also stapled on a couple of admittedly lore-breaking mechanics from the early Trails of Cold Steel games to make up for things that were lost when porting the Daybreak system to Sky. The combat is a hybrid of turn-based and action with the ability to swap between the two on the fly, and while the action mode is fairly simplistic, it mostly exists for clearing out large groups of weaker enemies, and every important and boss fight in the game is forced turn-based mode the entire time, as that is where all the build variety and complexity exists. Regardless of mode, all battles take place on the overworld, and that is what causes the largest deviation in area design from the original game, as pretty much anywhere where enemies appear is made bigger to accommodate large groups of large enemy models instead of just one guy on the overworld sending you into an encounter with a bunch of enemies. In action mode, each character has unique animations, but the way the moveset works is the same for everyone. You have a 3-hit combo and a dodge, as well as a heavy attack that uses up a meter with 2 charges that's built up by doing regular attacks and will be completely filled if you dodge with perfect timing. You also have a jump attack, but that's just executed by pressing attack right after a dodge. In addition to health, enemies also have a stun meter that's built up by dealing damage, with certain attacks increasing it by more than others, like the heavy attack in action mode being specifically a stunning tool, and when that meter fills up, the enemy will be stunned for a time, not being able to do anything in action mode, and having to take a turn off in turn-based mode. The enemy being stunned is also generally when you're going to want to press the button to change from action to turn-based mode, as it'll give you a massive advantage once the battle transitions into that. In turn-based mode, characters act in a defined order displayed on the left side of the screen, with the frequency each character shows up being determined by their speed stat. On your turn, you can move freely throughout the radius dictated by your character's movement stat until you perform an action. You got a few things that are exactly as you'd expect from a game like this. Attack, defend, and item being exactly what you'd expect, though running even is different, as it will actually just put you back into action combat mode, so you still need to physically get away from the enemy, and if an enemy attacks you while your HP is too low, you're gonna get put back into turn-based mode at a severe disadvantage in terms of turn order. In addition to HP, characters have 2 different meters that allow them to use special attacks. The blue one is EP, which is how you use your arts or magic in this game. A character's art loadout is determined by their orbment settings. Every character has a device called a tactical orbment, with a unique layout for each character and the ability to put up to 6 quartz in it. Quartz are a lot like materia. They come in different elements, and each one has an effect. Some of them are raw stat boosts, and some of them are more utility things like increased break damage, a buff to strength upon your HP dropping low, or a chance to inflict poison with all your attacks. What they don't do is directly give you arts. Instead, each quartz has a different elemental value, and so does each art in the game. In order for a character to have access to a given art, they need to have the requisite elemental value in quartz on one of the lines of slots on their orbment. The amount and direction of lines is different for each character, as well as which slots are restricted to a certain element of quartz, So some characters are predisposed to certain playstyles because of the element locks, and some are just better arts users independent of their base stats because they have longer lines on their orbments, giving them access to more powerful arts. You do also have a reference for every art in the game on the orbment screen, so you know exactly what to shoot for if you're going for a specific art. The arts present in the game are all the same ones from the original with a couple additions, though the effects and range of some of them have changed, and the entire element system has been revamped, so not only do quartz give different values, but arts require different values, for the most part being a lowering of overall numbers, which is only funny because the transition from original to Daybreak combat system has made a massive number creep because the Daybreak games just use higher numbers for literally everything. The last boss in the prologue had over 3 times the amount of HP as the final boss of the original version of Trails in the Sky, and my max HP values were already hitting pretty close to endgame levels. Also, a lot of abilities were given AoE that didn't have it in the original game, but that is to be expected because the Daybreak style combat and enemies being fought on the overworld as opposed to discrete encounters means that encounter sizes tend to be a lot larger than in the original Sky games. I'll also note that one of the things that made early game combat in the original game a drag is that your protagonists, Estelle and Joshua, start out with only 1 slot on their orbments unlocked. You're given exactly enough resources to unlock a second slot on 1 character during the tutorial, and then you're not really given a lot of those resources until a bit later on in the game, so the drop rate on that has been increased a lot, and as opposed to having 1 character with 2 slots and maybe 1 character with 3 slots by the end of the prologue, I had 4 slots open on both Estelle and Joshua, and then the third party member instantly joined with 5 slots open, so they're giving you a much wider selection of arts right out the gate, which is going to help the early game combat feel a lot more complex. I pretty easily had access to Earthguard by the end of the prologue, and while it was nerfed and I never needed to use it, that's pretty ridiculous. The other meter characters have the green one is for CP, or craft points, which are built up by dealing and taking damage, and can be used to execute each character's signature abilities called crafts. Crafts can do damage, debuffs, healing, buffs, and all that sort of thing, and are completely unique to each individual character, so while you could pretty reasonably give most characters most arts if you have the right quartz, the crafts are what make each character's playstyle completely unique. While a few party members not available in the demo appear to have gotten new ones, and Estelle and Joshua have seemingly lost their taunts entirely, all the crafts present in this remake are also ones the original game had, although usually buffed majorly to fit in with the new power crept version of the combat system. Just compare morale in the remake to base level morale from the original FC. It's ridiculous how much better it is. Although that's actually a good thing. One of the neat things about this game to me is how, in spite of remaking the combat system completely, they still did it in a way where the strats that were good in the original are still strats that are very good in this version. While the remake is admittedly easier than the original, despite having 1 additional higher level of difficulty than it is also difficult in the same ways and the same places the original game was. Half of my deaths came from playing this game like it was a Daybreak game and not Trails in the Sky, and all of the most notorious encounters, like the rigged chests and the final boss of the prologue, did still kill me multiple times and force me to adapt my loadout to fit the fight, which is so much easier and less frustrating to do, because this version of the game absolutely throws money and resources to get more quartz at you. Economy-wise, I do think it is a bit of a step in the opposite direction from the original game, which forced you to be notoriously frugal and not buy new equipment for all your party members every time you reach an upgrade. The OG did have an infinite money exploit through the cooking system where you could make a dish that sells for more than you buy the ingredients for, so ultimately this just cuts out the middleman and gives you more money than you could ever use right off the bat just by playing the game normally. Those shops do now sell cosmetic items, so it's possible they intended those as a money sink. To make a long story short, I did end up beating the prologue using a good old-fashioned strat. Stack speed on everyone, turn Joshua into a heal bot, and then just have Estelle spam Flare Arrow until the enemies are all dead. While we did unfortunately lose a lot of classic Estelle battle quotes like "come on" and "we're good to go," I have had the way she says when she uses a fire element art seared into my mind now, and I think that's going to become just as iconic. Anyway, going back to crafts, Estelle's crafts were notoriously bad in the original game, and her all-around stats were intended to be a jack-of-all-trades thing, but ended up not excelling in any category, except for physical defense, which is one of the least relevant stats in the entire game by the end of it. And because she's the protagonist, she is locked in your party for the entire first 2 games, so in the long run, the best way to use her is only using her party buff craft and the one that interrupts an enemy's cast, and then turning her into a heal/shield bot, because healing arts in the OG healed a set amount of HP based on the art instead of scaling based on the caster's stats. This was changed to be stat-based in the remake, and then Estelle was not only given much better crafts, like I actually used Hurricane in this version of the game, which is crazy, but her physical attack was also significantly increased to be higher than Joshua at base, so she now actually has a niche as a somewhat slower and tankier physical attacker who also has good enough magic stats to use arts pretty well while just outright being the best offensive caster in the prologue, because everyone else gets 2-shot by everything and she gets 3-shot. The super flashy animations I mentioned before are characters' S-crafts, or ultimate techniques. These cost 100 CP to use, though they will completely empty your bar no matter what number it's at, and if you're at 200 when you use them, they'll be much more potent. Estelle got another buff here, as her S-craft was given a decent-sized AoE, as well as a 50% chance to inflict a pretty debilitating status effect, while Joshua's remains single target, so you actually have a much bigger reason to use it now. The biggest thing about S-crafts, though, is undoubtedly the ability to S-break. Or, if a character has enough CP to use their S-craft, you can activate it whenever, and that character will jump ahead in the turn order and immediately use their S-craft right after the current turn. S-crafts have been nerfed, though, in such a way consistent with Daybreak, as you can no longer use them to steal an enemy's turn bonus, though you can still do that by stunning the enemy or delaying their next turn. This has admittedly taken away a lot of the strategy that comes in using S-breaks, where in the original you would intentionally use it even if it might put a character in an unoptimal position in order to prevent an enemy from getting a guaranteed crit or big HP heal. So I'm not really sure about that. Now you're just kind of going to use it as a finisher to make sure an enemy's dead before it gets another turn, to top off the stun meter before an enemy can get another turn, or just to dump your CP gauge before the character dies, as that empties upon death anyway. So I'm not really sure how to feel about that. But I'm also kind of concerned that they're gonna end up being too powerful, as in the Daybreak games, S-crafts could only be used effectively once every 3 turns per character, effectively cost an extra resource to use, and didn't have a bonus 200 CP enhanced version. Now though, we've reverted back to Sky-style S-crafts while maintaining the resource economy of a Daybreak game, and seeing how the second craft Estelle learns gives the entire party, including herself, 3 turns of CP regen, I am somewhat concerned that this game is going to devolve into S-craft spam in the endgame, even more so than a lot of other Trails entries. Another somewhat janky mechanic is support abilities, a set of passive traits characters learn that allow them to help out allies in combat, like taking a hit for them while automatically defending, finishing off an enemy that got left with low HP, or doing some auto heals. These were justified by mechanics in the Daybreak system that don't exist here, where they would only activate if characters were in close proximity to each other, but in this case it looks like they could just kind of do it across the battlefield no problem, which makes me think that that might become overpowered eventually too. Joining us from the Cold Steel games, we have the Brave meter and Brave attacks, as well as Overdrive. The Brave meter is a 5-segment gauge that gradually fills up by landing hits in action combat, as well as filling up by an entire segment every time you crit, stun an enemy, or hit an enemy that's already stunned. When landing an attack under any of those conditions, you can also have another party member follow up with a regular physical attack of their own, or spend 3 Brave gauge points to execute a chain attack, which is a much more powerful combination of strikes between 2 party members that also has some AoE on it. In the games where this system originated, there are very set rules for who does the follow-up or chain, but it seemed mostly random for me when I had 3 party members, so that could be an issue later where you want a specific character to get the follow-up for whatever reason, Though if it just ends up being whoever the closest party member is, that's not really an issue, I guess. Honestly, the biggest problem I had with this entire subsystem so far was my own muscle memory betraying me, because in the Daybreak games you get bonuses for standing next to other party members, so I kept instinctively doing it here when there's absolutely no reason to, which led to my characters getting 2-for-1'd by short-range AoE a whole bunch of times. Overdrive is a boost state characters can access that cures debuffs and grants them immunity for 2 turns, as well as giving massive stat bonuses that differ depending on the character using it. This is a perfectly fine mechanic, and it seems like major bosses are going to get access to it as well based on the final boss of the prologue, but my only complaint is the same with the follow-up attacks and the Brave Gauge stuff, which is they don't really give enough information on how exactly this works. In the Cold Steel games, in addition to knowing exactly who you could do the follow-up attack with, Overdrive used a gauge shared amongst the entire party to activate, and you could physically see that gauge fill up and know when you were able to activate it. In this game, characters overdrive independently of each other, and you can have multiple going at the same time, but there's no indicator for when a character is going to gain access to it. They'll just have it at the beginning of their turn sometimes with seemingly no rhyme or reason, which hasn't been annoying so far. There's no fight that I feel like I would have lost if I didn't happen to get overdrive at the right time, but you do lose out on the strategy of playing around when you're going to get access to it again, and the only real strategizing you can really do with it is have overdrive going into a boss fight and don't activate it until you need to. In spite of all these minor nitpicks, I very much enjoyed the combat so far. I wouldn't say it's at the same level of complexity as one of the Daybreak games, but it doesn't have to be enjoyable, and ultimately, this is a remake of the first game in the series. This battle system was added to modernize things a bit for a 2020s remake, but ultimately, this is still a remake of the first game in the series, so it probably shouldn't be as complex from the get-go as the 11th. I was actually really surprised to see escort battles return, as that's something that's never existed in the 3D era of the series period, and while I have seen some people complain about them online already, I honestly had zero issues with them whatsoever so far. The NPCs you need to protect are a lot smarter and less actively suicidal than they ever were in any of the older games, and the only time I ever actually got a game over due to the escort NPC dying was because I was still underestimating the amount of damage things would do on the highest difficulty, and someone got one-shot. On top of all this and the pre-existing easy mode, there are also a few more really nice quality of life features that make it a lot easier to get unstuck if you're hardwalled at a certain fight. Making the overworld areas larger also allowed the developers to make exploring them more rewarding. While the treasure chests in this game are identical to the original in location and nearly identical in contents, I ran into a lot of items just lying on the ground, and most of them ended up being permanent stat boosters. On top of that, there's also an in-game achievement system, and I'm not just talking about the fact that the Steam/PS achievements exist within the game itself. There's more of a milestone system that gives a lot of good rewards for more or less just doing things in the game like you normally would, that range from free money, good quartz, consumables, more stat boosters, and pretty good accessories that you can get from that way sooner than they'd be available in a shop. So all of that alongside the new quality of life features makes this a very smooth experience to play, regardless of your skill level or the difficulty you're on. The most surprising thing in this vein was the one new area I've found so far, which is a hidden away cave that is literally across the street from the entrance to the final dungeon of the prologue, which contains a huge amount of enemies for the purpose of grinding experience and resources that even seem to scale with your party's level, so they always give you good drops. This is the exact kind of thoughtfulness you want to see from a game that's looking to be the watershed moment for more people starting the Trail series. While most side quests in the Sky games come from an assignment board, there are some hidden quests that can only be triggered by talking to a specific NPC at a specific time in the main story, and in keeping with more recent Trails games, they've also made these a lot harder to miss, as there are explicitly icons on the map indicating that you should talk to someone to get something, as well as other optional events and conversations, which is especially good for this remake, as the original game had some absurdly rude ones that involved doing one story beat in one location, backtracking to the beginning of the chapter to talk to one person, and then going back to the place you just were to continue the story. So not only can you just fast travel to do that, but you'll also get a map indicator that you should do that. And most importantly, the minimap icons for NPCs change color if they have no new dialogue for you, so it's infinitely easier to make your rounds and talk to everyone after each story beat, which is an integral part of playing Trails for a lot of people. Even though it's a 20-year-old game, the original Trails in the Sky is still super playable and has aged incredibly well over the past 2 decades. And perhaps even because of that age, one word I could easily use to describe the experience of playing it is comfy. And that comfy feeling definitely still exists in the remake too. The way I see it is like this. Trails in the Sky never actually needed a proper remake. All it really needed to make the series more popular and more accessible was a remaster, maybe adding voice acting and a few more quality of life options like Trails from Zero and Trails from Azure got a few years ago, and for that to be released on all modern platforms instead of being a PC exclusive like the original currently is. A remake is what we got though, and thankfully, playing through this feels just the same way as playing through the original game for the first time did for me, and it seems like a lot of other people who've tried out the demo so far. The original 2004 game was a PC game, though the only other platform it was ported to was the PSP, and instead of being a remake of a PSP RPG, it feels like a very, very well done remaster of a classic PS2 JRPG, and like, we're getting this from a parallel universe where Trails in the Sky was a fully 3D game for home consoles from the beginning. Let us end though by talking about the most controversial part of this entire remake, and that is the localization. The localized scripts created by Xseed Games for the original Trails in the Sky trilogy are very, very highly regarded by fans of the series, and are some of the most iconic things the Trails series as a whole is known for amongst the wider fanbase. When the remake was confirmed not just to be published by GungHo as opposed to Xseed or NIS America, but also feature a brand new localization, one with the stated goal of being more faithful to the original Japanese text, a lot of people were very concerned that it just wouldn't be as iconic and would make the story of the game less well received by people playing the remake first. After having played the entire prologue, how is this new localization? Well, I reserve my right to make final judgment until I've seen a lot of other later scenes in the game play out and have seen how Olivier is translated, but so far it is okay, I guess. It was always expected that a lot of lines would need to be changed to accommodate voice acting, both for timing reasons and because the original script was not written with voice acting in mind, but it seems like literally every single line in the game has been completely redone from the ground up, which is much different than expected because some preliminary screenshots of the English version of the game used verbatim quotes from the Xseed script. This has caused the loss of every single iconic line from the original game, and coupling that with the fact that 3D Trails games don't have a "this chest is empty" message when you recheck a treasure chest after opening it, means that the other big iconic thing from the original localization, the customized messages for every single treasure chest in the game, are also completely absent from this version, and I'd be lying if I said that this doesn't cause a loss of a lot of original charm. The visuals and voice performances are able to make up for that so far, but it remains to be seen whether or not that will be consistent throughout the rest of the game. While a lot of the new lines do still hit the emotion and the humor when they need to, and it does seem like the dialogue writing style is at least attempting to mimic how those characters are written in other games, it does definitely feel like the driest and most literal translation a Trails game has ever had. This is evident especially by the fact that Estelle says the word cheeky like a dozen times just within the prologue, when the Xseed script sometimes translated words differently when they were repeated a lot because repetition just does not sound as good in English compared to Japanese. In spite of this, I can't really call the localization bad so far. I just would have vastly preferred an adapted Xseed script tailored for the voice acting, similar to how the Crossbell fan translations were adapted into the official releases of those games, as opposed to a complete ground-up redo, which just seems like adding a whole bunch more work for the localization team for basically no reason, except generating more controversy. Especially because this game is Falcom's first simultaneous worldwide release, and that could not have been easy to do while completely rewriting the script from scratch, especially because, as far as we know, even the Japanese script is going to have some significant changes later on in the story, as well as brand new content. Despite all these complaints, as of the end of the prologue, it's definitely at the point where, if I didn't have a previous localization of the same game to go off of, I don't think I would be complaining about this one a whole lot at all, but it remains to be seen how my opinion will change as the game goes on, and especially as characters whose dialogue is very, very important to get right, like Olivier, are introduced. The most contentious non-dialogue thing with the localization, though, is definitely the fact that there are some inconsistencies between this and not just the original script, but also other games in the Trails series. While all major character names stay the same, there are several NPC names that have been changed compared to the original game, and while changing Claire to Cruz is genuinely more accurate to her Japanese name, and the character called Milano in the remake being called Murano in the original game is explicitly a mistake in the original localization that people who worked on it have pointed out, Armand and Ellie were changed to Ariam and Arya, which not only are just as inaccurate to their Japanese names as the original names were, but also they're characters that show up in later games in the series. So now people who play this remake and then the Crossbell arc are going to be confused because the same characters have different names. A few Art and Quartz names are also changed slightly, which is weird because their Japanese names are English words written out in katakana, so unless those were also changed in Japanese as well, which I'm fairly certain they weren't, the new localization is outright less accurate in some places. The names of the 4 towers have also been changed. For example, Esmelas Tower is now Jade Tower, which does seem to be a new official name for it by Falcom, as there's a sign in English saying Jade Tower in this game. But in this case at least, that does make it more accurate to the original Japanese name, and isn't a big deal for inconsistent terminology because not only are the towers never really mentioned by individual name again after the Sky games, but all other mentions of the term Esmelas are still intact. A few terms do have their pronunciation in the dub altered though. Zin's name is back to being pronounced Zin Vathek instead of Jin Vatek like it was in the Daybreak games, and the pronunciation of the name of the country the game takes place in has also been changed. The last 7 games in the Trails series were consistent with calling it Liberal, and while Estelle does let a few of those slip early on, the remake overall goes with Liberal. Now, yeah, the name of the kingdom is obviously supposed to be a riff on the English word liberal, and this pronunciation is just pronouncing that word as if it were 2 syllables instead of 3, but the Japanese name is actually closest to liberal than anything else. So not only is this an inconsistency, but again, the old pronunciation is the more accurate one. On top of that, and this might just be my own personal opinion, I think pronouncing it closer to liberal doesn't work quite as well. While the name itself is perfectly fine in Japanese, they unintentionally chose to base it on an English word that's very, very funny in this context in English, so I think the liberal pronunciation was an intentional move to try and step away from that a little bit to maintain immersion. Well, yeah, people were always making jokes about the liberal kingdom. Those always existed outside the game itself to some extent. But now in this remake, one of the first things that happens is Cassius Bright asking his daughter to pick up a copy of the liberal news for him, which is just goofy enough to sort of harm my verisimilitude. It might seem like I'm harping a lot on a very minor point, but not only is this a big inconsistency with other games, that's indicative of the localization team behind this one not checking the work of the rest of the series and intentionally being consistent with that, but also, especially the name of the country is going to be one of the most frequently said words across not only this game, but the rest of the trilogy if those get remade as well, so it's pretty important to get right in my opinion. In non-localization related issues, I did also notice a few outright typos and grammatical errors. Ultimately though, this is still a demo, so it's almost certainly not the final build of the game, and while I don't think any voice dialogue is going to be changed, so we're stuck with Liberal and Zin for at least the rest of this game, there is a decent chance that these typos and even some of the NPC names may have already been fixed, and those script changes just didn't make it into the demo build. I think the best way I could sum this up is by saying that the script would have very, very much benefited from an extra editing pass done by people very familiar with the other Trails games, and especially all of that being done before voice recording started, as well as some extra effort being gone into the direction to maintain consistency. It would definitely be harsh to call it outright bad so far. I think at worst it's on par with one of the weaker NIS localizations that's not the completely broken original Ys 8 script, but it is definitely my biggest complaint with this remake so far by a pretty large margin. I do have hope that GungHo is able to rectify these issues either in patches or at the very least in the Sky 2nd Chapter remake if that exists, but it is still a major bummer to see now. I will also give GungHo absolutely massive credit for also localizing the game into French, Spanish, and German, which is a massive deal because Western Trails localizations have been English only since they started existing, and while the dub is only English, this is a massive step forward for new people being able to play the series at all. All that being said, this is still a very beautiful game that I had a whole lot of fun with, and still tells the Trails in the Sky story that I grew to know and love back in 2020, and I'm still extremely excited to dig into the full game next month. And I would absolutely still encourage anyone who's even remotely interested in trying out the Trails series to at least check out this demo, because it is a very good window into a franchise that so many people are so rabid and fanatical about. Assuming the rest of the remake is as well executed as this prologue is, the biggest concern with starting here is the fact that the second Trails in the Sky game is a direct continuation off the ending of this one, and that remake is certainly not going to be out by the time you finish this, so you're either waiting a year or hoping you have a PC so you can immediately download the original version of Trails in the Sky second chapter. Falcom does have a lot on their plate right now, but in making the Sky first chapter remake, they did already make almost all the assets they'd need to remake the second game as well, so hopefully we don't have to wait too long for that remake, and can get the complete story, as well as hopefully Sky the Third, all in this new style. It's actually crazy to think about, honestly. If the entire Sky trilogy gets remade, then the only thing preventing the entire Trails series from being universally available on most modern platforms is the fact that the Western versions of Cold Steel 1 and 2 still haven't been ported to Switch. And with localizations for new games finally being caught up to Japan as of the beginning of next year, that being the biggest issue in terms of accessibility to the Trails series is so small compared to how things were when I started playing only 5 years ago that it's almost a non-issue in comparison. Seeing how much the Trails series has grown since I first fell in love with it has made me so happy, and I can't wait to see how many new people this remake will bring in as well. Until next time though, I'm going to be thinking about Xenoblade a whole lot again. So this is Luxon, signing off.